All right. Being mindful of time, we are going to officially get started. I want to welcome you all to our virtual speaker series for 2025. Today's webinar is titled Transform the Way You Support Kids, Unlock the Power of Regulation, Strategies That Work. It's provided to you by the PA Care Partnership, which is a statewide systems of care grant in association with the Office of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, better known as OMSAS. And I will toss it over to Colleen to introduce our presenter.
All right. Thanks, Jamal. I appreciate that. I'm excited. I get to introduce Josh. He and I were talking and we realized it's been 7 years when I first met you, over 7 years, because I remember your wife had a baby when I first met you. So welcome. We're happy to have you. For those of you who may not know Josh, he is a global leader in brain-based trauma-informed support for children. He is actually a former teacher, and he saw the need for new approaches and now works with schools, agencies, and governments worldwide. In 2022, he co-founded In Mind Services to support those who support children. And he is also the author of 101 Brain Breaks. So with that, enjoy this next hour plus with Josh. Josh.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I am really looking forward to spending this time with everyone today. Obviously, we will dig into some hopefully great content throughout this presentation, and then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So please feel free, if you have questions as we go, feel free to type them in so that they're stored in the chat. Or beyond that, when we kind of stop at the end, please feel free to share any questions you might have. Because my goal for this time that we get to spend together is just that you're able to walk away from it with a tangible ideas, tangible tools, and mindset shift for how you might be able to support some of the children that are within your care in a different way and in a way that's really going to honor where they are at. So before we dive into the content, I just want to give you a tiny bit more of a picture of who I am and where I kind of came from to get to this spot here today. As was mentioned, I am the CEO of In Mind Services. Our mission is that we support those who support children. So we work with schools, we work with other organizations, we partner directly with families as well, to really just try to find who are the people on the front lines with students and with children in general, to try to give them and equip them with tools and ideas for how they can support the kids in their lives. We're called In Mind because with everything we do, as you'll see in this presentation today, we try to take a brain-based approach. We try to do our best to understand and help others understand what may be going on a neurodevelopmental level, and really utilize that to help us to really match some of the tools that we might try to utilize with the actual needs of the children that we're having the opportunity to work with. A little bit about myself more personally. I began my career as a teacher, as was spoken. I specifically worked in alternative education. I worked for an organization that some of you are familiar with, Lakeside. They ran alternative schools. And so I taught 9th and 11th grade English for a number of years. And I'm not going to lie, when I first started my career there, I was just super excited. I had all the passion in the world to try to make a difference in the lives of these kids, specifically working with kids who had been asked to leave the traditional school setting. My kind of biggest prep was probably to watch Freedom Writers one too many times and just think that I could, with all that passion and gusto, change these kids' lives. And it took me about one day of actually being in the classroom to realize that I was very ill equipped to actually meet some of the needs of the students that I was with. That their needs, the way that they behaved, the way that they kind of needed support did not align at all with my approaches and what I had been taught in school for how to teach and how to support others. And so I very quickly found myself going down this path where not only was I not equipped to be able to support my students in the way that they needed to be supported. But what I saw myself going down, and I've seen a lot of other people who work on the front lines with children begin to go down similar paths. And that's where I began to blame the students. It seems like they didn't care. It seems like they didn't want to be there. It seems like they didn't want to learn. And all of their behaviors really led to that understanding. But something about that just didn't sit right with me. In my years of teaching and my years since of, working and consulting with schools and other organizations, I don't believe I've ever actually come across a single student who I honestly believe wakes up in the morning and says, man, I hope I failed today. I hope I get kicked out of class today, or I hope I let somebody down today. I don't think any child chooses that intentionally, but I have come across a lot of students who are comfortable with failure. A lot of children who have failed academically, socially, behaviorally, far more times than they've been successful. But we cannot confuse a child's comfort level with failure as a desire to fail. So as I was trying to figure out what are my next steps? What do I need to do different? How do I kind of help to support my students differently? That's when I was first introduced to this idea that's become really popular about trauma-informed education. And most specifically, I did a lot of my training through a great organization called the Neurosequential Network. And they do training on what's called the neurosequential model of education and the neurosequential model of therapeutics, as well as others. But those are the two programs that I went through. And really, what I learned from that is a lot of what we'll kind of touch on today, which is that understanding of what's going on within a child's brain and what are their needs based on their behaviors at that exact moment in time. And so, as I was able to learn more about that, it allowed me to really transform the work that I was doing in my classroom to actually begin to meet my students where they were at in a much more real way. And thankfully, I saw a lot of success pretty quickly in my classroom. And that led to, as was spoken earlier in my bio, a lot of opportunities for me to go out and train all over the world with what can be done in other classrooms and in other settings. And what I found interesting was that over the years, I kept hearing the same question asked again and again and again from school leaders and those who worked in more academic settings. And they said, what happens when a child goes home? We've done so much kind of work here at the school setting, but then at some point the child goes home and so much of that feels like it's getting undone, or they don't have the same support at home, or the parents just aren't kind of built up with some of the same knowledge for how to support a child in the same way that we're beginning to learn in the academic setting. And that was really the catalyst that got us to launch In Mind Services, and really the catalyst that has brought us here today. And that is that we really want to work with every single person who works on the front lines with children to really make sure that we're once again taking that neurodevelopmental approach. That every single time we're engaging in a conversation or an activity or whatever the situation is that we might need to be encountering a child or collaborating with a child, taking a step back and saying, are they ready for this? Are they regulated right now? Are they in a spot in their brain where they're really able to engage in whatever this activity might be? And so, really, as we get started, we're going to be using this word regulation. I'll be honest, there's a lot of different definitions of regulation and self-regulation. They all mean the same basic thing. So I'm going to use one here, but you might even hear me use slightly different wording throughout the presentation. But they all are really capturing the same basic idea. And that's that when somebody is regulated, they have the ability to self-reflect between a feeling and a response to that feeling. Now, what I think is so important that we are first capturing here is that when we're talking about regulation, we're talking about an ability. An ability is something that is practiced, it's built upon, it's formulated. It's not something that every single person has the capacity to do in every single situation. And so I think that that's one of those first things that we want to keep in mind, especially when we are interacting with a child who may not be behaving in the manner in which we expect them to behave, is that so often our responses, whether that's verbal or whether that's behavioral, our responses to those behaviors of concern so often imply that that child made a conscious decision to behave in a way that didn't align with our expectations. And the reality is that, quite frankly, they probably simply weren't regulated. And by that, we mean they probably, in that moment, did not have the ability to self-reflect, that they had a feeling, whether that's internal based on their internal feelings or external based on something that's happening in the world around them, but they had a feeling and they didn't have the ability to put self-reflection there, to really put thought there so that they were able to respond in a way that, once again, would align with our expectations for them in that specific situation that they're in. I think it's important that we understand a little bit of kind of the foundation of where self-regulation really comes from and our first experiences developing self-regulation, because sometimes knowing a little bit about that and knowing a little bit about the children that we have the opportunity to work with and whether or not they had some of these experiences can actually lead to a basic understanding of why they might struggle with some self-regulation later in life. Our kind of first exposure to a need for any level of self-regulation really comes as soon as we are born. When we are in utero, we exist in this like perfect situation in most scenarios. It is temperature controlled. You are fed on the spot anytime you need it. You are cushioned. You're never, if the person falls down, you're not getting hurt at all. Like you are in this perfectly controlled environment. And then suddenly, on your very first day of life, you are born into this world that is cold or hot. You are uncomfortable. You feel hunger for the very first time. And your brain's response to all of those things is like, oh, shoot, the world is ending. Any little bit of discomfort that we have, every single human being's natural response to that is absolute terror. And we move immediately to tears. Now, this presentation is at 12 o'clock. That is lunchtime for most people. And I'm going to guess if you happen to not get a chance to eat before this presentation, you're not going to spend the entire hour that I'm talking just in tears, absolutely bawling and upset because you feel hunger and your body is telling you, oh my goodness, I might never get a meal again. But instead, when you were a newborn, you were able to learn pretty quickly that, you know what? I get hungry, I feel really upset, but then somebody feeds me. I get hungry, I get upset, and somebody feeds me. And slowly you move away from having these big old, tears and crying to maybe making a little bit of noise to suddenly you know that that food is going to come and you don't have to cry anymore. That is self-regulation. You're building the capacity to have a feeling. I feel hunger, I feel uncomfortable, and then you're able to self-reflect and realize, I know that food's going to come, or I know that I'm equipped with the ability to request whatever that food is or whatever that sustenance is. And the same thing goes along with, a lot of other skills, very basic that we learn early on in life, but then obviously more complex as we get older. And so when we have consistent caregiving when we're young, that helps to really set us up for great predictability and great self-regulatory skills because we're learning quickly that I have a manageable need and then support comes in place. And so I'm learning that waiting for that thing and putting a little bit of pause, having that moment of self-reflection before my responses typically is going to work. And it's predictable that a positive outcome is possible on the other side of things. But if you work with kids that might not have had as consistent caregiving, that their ability to develop some of those first self-regulatory skills wasn't as conditioned as we would want it to be, well, that's going to then be predictable that they're going to struggle to develop self-regulatory skills throughout the course of their life because it wasn't consistent when they were young. And so it doesn't mean that it can't happen as they get older, but it might mean that they need more help and more support to really be able to arrive in that spot. So kind of moving a little bit further on with this, as we begin to think about what is self-regulation, we really want to make sure that we're focusing on understanding the brain and understanding kind of what's going on within the brain. Our brains are very, very complex. And so this is a fairly simplified version of the brain by Bruce Perry and the Neurosequential Network. And so they're really taking the brain and breaking it into 4 basic regions: the brainstem, the midbrain, the limbic system, and the cortex. And the first and one of the most important things to understand about the brain is that it actually develops from the bottom up. And so when you are in utero, your primary region of development is your brain stem. In the first couple years of life, your primary region of development is the midbrain. From about age 2 to 3, all the way to about ages 12 or 13, the primary region of development is the limbic system. And then from about 12 to 13, all the way to the end of adolescence, and depending on who you ask now, that's actually getting into your early 30s, the primary region of development is the cortex. And the reason that's important to understand is that what they've learned about trauma and adversity is that it's less about what happens to you and more about when the traumatic event occurs. Because the region of the brain that's primarily developing at the time of the traumatic event is the region of the brain that's going to be most significantly impacted by that traumatic event. So if you have a child who's experienced some type of adversity in utero, that's going to impact the development of that brain stem, which is likely to lead to health and behavioral issues later in life. If you experience some type of adversity in the first couple of years of life, that's going to impact your midbrain, which once again is likely to lead to health and behavioral issues later in life. And one kind of side note to make about this is that all of that I just described at the brain stem and the midbrain has occurred prior to that child possessing the ability to create memory. So we have kids who are significantly impacted by life experiences that they have absolutely no memory of whatsoever. But to kind of turn this back with this basic understanding that we just formed here about the brain and the development of the brain, what's important to realize is that when we talk about that maldevelopment, what we're actually talking about is a hyperdensity of neuropathways. Our brain's number one job is to keep us physically safe. And our brain looks at almost all stressful situations as potentially dangerous situations, as physically dangerous situations. And so our brain is going to look at things that are going on around us. And when we're in a highly stressful moment, our brain goes into overdrive, collecting as much data as it possibly can to try to make sense of what is this situation that I'm in right now, looking both for signs of safety, but also trying to really create a template for that situation so that you don't find yourself in that situation again in the future. So you're preparing for that. But in that moment in time, your brain starts to collect way more data than it actually needs to. It has way more neurons firing and wiring together, and they're creating this hyperdensity of neuropathways. And so suddenly what happens is that when somebody is exposed to a lot of high stress, anxiety, trauma in these early years of life, it creates this hyperdensity of neuropathways in this lower part of the brain, which then makes that part of the brain literally more dense. The other thing that's important to know about the brain is that it operates from the bottom up. So as I'm talking right now, information's coming into your eyes from what you see on the screen, coming into your ears from what you hear me saying out loud, but it all goes to the same part of the brain. It goes to the bottom first, and then the goal is that it travels up to the higher regions where it circulates through your long and short-term memory. So typically it comes into the brainstem, hops on some neurotransmitters, and just takes a highway right up to the top of the brain. But when you've experienced that early life adversity, suddenly it tries to hop on those neurotransmitters and take a highway, but it hits a traffic jam. And so suddenly your information stops much, much lower in the brain and it's not accessing the cortex. So if we have a basic understanding of each part of the brain, we begin to A, understand regulation a little bit better, but B, we begin to understand that different behaviors actually indicate that perhaps a child might have gotten stuck a little bit lower in their brain and they're behaving in a way that we would call dysregulated. They're behaving in a way that's not giving them the opportunity to put that pause, to put that time and space between their feelings and the reactions that they're actually going to have about it. So when we're at the very, very top of your brain, that's where you have your higher level of thinking. When you're accessing your cortex, that is your absolute highest level of thinking. You basically need to have access to your cortex to be regulated. The top part of your brain is that most regulated part of your brain. And so it allows you to think and reflect and plan. When you're asking somebody to think before they act, it is assuming that they have access to that cortical part of their brain so that they're actually able to put thought in between what it is that they're thinking, what the situation calls for, and the actual actions that they're going to do next. When you're a little bit lower in your brain, you're in that limbic part of the brain. That's that social and emotional, relational part of your brain. This is a part of the brain that cares much more about feelings of safety, feelings of connection, wanting to know that they are really kind of relationally safe with those who are around them at that point in time. When you move a little bit lower in the brain, you get to the midbrain, and that's where a lot of our physicality really comes out of. There's other things as well, but the thing that we see most and that can be the most worrisome or troublesome is physicality. That could be constant movement, fidgeting, small movements, kicking the legs, standing up, pacing around, or it can also be much, much bigger and more aggressive looking movements as well, which could be, flipping a piece of furniture over, eloping out of a space. A lot of that is really coming out of the midbrain. And then the brainstem is your basic life functioning, your blood pressure, your heart rate, your body's temperature. And when you have a heart rate and blood pressure that might not be as well regulated as we want, that could spike or plummet very, very quickly, you're going to have a child who is likely to just kind of explode, blow up, yell, scream, punch, hit, like just seemingly out of nowhere with no big kind of scaling that's following that. A lot of what I talked about there were externalizing responses. It's important to realize that one can be dysregulated and have internalizing responses as well. And that's literally where the lower they get in their brain, they actually become more and more shut down. And so they begin to kind of daydream. They might actually fall asleep. They might dissociate from the situation around them. I've worked with a couple of different children who would get so kind of stressed in a specific situation that it would actually cause them to pass out in those moments in time. And so what we see though is that when they are dysregulated, they are lower and lower in the brain. So when we're talking about helping a child to become regulated, we're talking about helping them to reach the cortex. And so I think that that's really important for kind of our lens, our mindset when we're thinking about what does regulation actually mean. It means that a child is able to access their cortex in that moment in time. And that's what really means that they're going to be regulated. Real quick, one other thing while we're on this slide that I think is important to understand is that not only does trauma and adversity and development impact our level of regulation, but stress impacts it as well. While our brains develop from the bottom up, we get stressed from the top down, meaning the more stress that we experience, the more likely we are to have higher regions of the brain begin to literally get shut down. The more stressed we are, our brain says, you know what, cortex, we don't need you right now. You're not going to keep us alive right now. That's not helpful. We move into that relational, emotional part of the brain. And similarly, depending on the situation, our brain might say, you know what, we don't need you right now either. And you're kind of offline. And we then move down to that more survival part of the brain, which is the brainstem and the midbrain. And that's that part of the brain that's just trying to keep us alive. It's just reflex. It's responding to what's going on around us without any thought in front of it whatsoever. And once again, this is what likely leads to a lot of these kind of more challenging moments, these really dysregulated behaviors that we might see from a lot of students. And so the most classic way that we have, traditionally thought about regulation is what you would call cortical modulation. And that's where you rely on your cortex to regulate the lower regions of your brain. It regulates your physical control. It regulates your emotional responses to things. Now, here's the reality. I would imagine that the vast majority of people that are accessing this training right now, cortical modulation is probably your go-to mode for regulating during stressful situations. This is the part of your brain where you might be at work and a coworker or a client might really upset you, and you have some choice words that you would like to say to them, but you're like, you know what? I still like getting a paycheck, so I'm not going to say those words because I'm going to get fired. Or you might want to act or behave in a certain type of way, but you realize, you know what? I better not do that right now because you can see the bigger picture. That's cortical modulation. Those impulses are very, very normal. It's normal to have really bizarre thoughts. It's normal to have words that you might want to say to somebody else. All of that is very, very normal. But when you have the ability to cortically modulate, your cortex has the ability to say, you know what? Don't say that right now. It's not worth it. Don't act that way right now. It's not going to be good for you. And because we as mature adults are able to cortically modulate, we assume that most other people can as well. But once again, if somebody has struggles accessing their cortex, if somebody struggles to be able to be there very often because of stress, because of development, then they cannot rely on their cortex to control those lower regions of their brain. And so the typical kind of go-to things like just expecting them to think before they act, or, higher level of thinking and reasoning, all these things that we want somebody else to do, that does not work if they cannot consistently access the cortex. And so this is where we really need to turn this upside down. This is where we need to think of a whole new approach to what does regulation actually look like. And so that's where this whole idea of the 3 R's formed by Bruce Perry really comes in place. And that's regulate, relate, reason. And this is kind of the order of operations, if you will, for how we can help a child to become regulated in a really challenging and difficult moment. And so this can kind of go two different ways. First off, and ideally, this is a proactive approach. And so before we have the really, really big behaviors of concern, we want to be walking into a situation, whatever your scenario might be with a client, with a child, works with adults as well, if you happen to work with adults. But as you enter into your environment with them, the first thing you're asking yourself is, does this person or this group of people seem regulated right now? By that, I mean, are they acting as calm as they are ever able to act? Are they able to focus as well as they ever are? Are they acting as age appropriate as they ever do? Obviously, please hear all those disclaimers in there as much as they can ever do. But are they basically at their personal calmest? Are they at their personal best as it relates to regulation? If the answer to that is yes, you can kind of put that mental check in and move forward. If the answer to that is no, then you really, before we can begin to move forward with whatever it is that you're hoping to do with them, we need to provide some regulatory opportunities for them. And we're going to, in a few minutes, really discuss what some of those different ideas are, what some things are that you might be able to do to help an individual to regulate. As we move up a little bit more, this is where you get to the relationship piece. So once they're regulated, once their body really begins to seem calm, the next step is to make sure that our relationship with them is in order. And so once again, we're sequentially working our way up the brain. We're now at the limbic part of the brain. And this is where they need to feel this certain level of relational safety with whomever they are around and whoever they're really interacting with. And so at times like this, it's really important to just think through, is there anything that's coming in between my relationship with them right now? Is there any reason that they might be offended by something that I said or that I did? Like, what does it really look like to make sure that this relationship is in order? And one of the things that I think is really key about being attuned to where you're at relationally with somebody is that it's more about their perspective than it is about our perspective. We might feel fine with them, but if they don't feel fine with us, they're not going to be able to move up to that next level. They're not going to be able to get to that cortex and dive into the reasoning side of things. I had a student once, her name was, we'll call her Deja. Deja walked into my classroom one day. She was regulated. She was clearly cool, calm, and collected. And as she walked past me into the classroom, she looked at me and she said, I am still mad at you about the grade you gave me yesterday. And then she went and she sat down in her seat and she put her head down, which was not normal behavior for her. And I knew that I was kind of missing out on her for the class period. So once again, to kind of look at it in this order, she was regulated. I didn't really have to worry about that. I knew that she was upset, but for some reason, she was taking personal the grade that she had received from me the previous day. And because she was taking that personal, children do this really interesting thing. When they feel personally offended by somebody, their behavior typically hurts them more than it hurts others. So, specifically for me in an academic setting, that was her choosing, I'm not going to do my schoolwork right now because she was associating with that as a sign of really kind of showing disrespect towards me. And so doing work would have been showing respect towards me. And she was feeling so individually hurt from that situation right there. What I thought was interesting was that she and I didn't have an argument. She and I didn't say anything or I didn't treat her any differently or in any way that I regret or wish that I hadn't. She was feeling offended by a grade that she had received. And so that was her perspective. I was really surprised by it. I didn't see it coming. So it wasn't this like two-way thing. This was largely in her mind that she said, you know what, you disrespected me with that grade, therefore I am upset with you. It would have been very easy for me to say, that's on you. Get over it. Let's move forward. And I'm not going to lie, a younger, less trauma informed version of myself might have responded in a way kind of similar to that. But the reality is this, her, her reality, her perspective, that is her real life. That is her reality. And so the way that she was looking at it was that she felt disrespected. And so for me to kind of check that relationship box with her, I needed to go over and show her some level of respect. I needed to connect with her in that spot. And so I walked over, I got down at her level. I said, listen, my classroom's filling up with students right now. I don't have time to really figure this all out right now, but I hear that you're upset. I hear that you're frustrated. I really want us to work through this together. Can we meet at lunch today to talk through whatever happened yesterday? But I don't want what happened yesterday to impact today. And so taking those, 45 seconds or whatever that was to talk to her, to let her know that I see her, I hear her, and I validate how she's feeling, and I'm going to show respect to her by us working at it later that day. That was enough for her to feel heard, feel cared for, and then prepared to move on. And so once that was done, then she could get up to the cortex, that reasoning. And the reasoning is just what most of us were hired to do in the first place. It's, in my case, in that situation, it was teaching. For some, it's problem solving or counseling with children, or doing long-term planning or behavior planning or whatever the case might be. But that higher level of thinking that can plan for the future, that can reflect on past behavior, you need to be in your cortex to be able to do that. And when we're taking a bottom-up regulation approach, they need to be regulated. Their body needs to be calm. They need to feel relationally safe. And that's where we can then get up to that top part of the brain and do that kind of hard work that we want to be able to do with them. And depending on your role and how much time you're spending with them, after 15 or 20 minutes, especially if the nature of what you're doing with them is something that they find to be pretty stressful, you might want to check in again. Do they still seem regulated? If not, I might need to offer something different. Is that relationship still in order, or did any interaction happen that maybe I need to apologize for or check in with them about? And then you're in that spot once again to keep learning, to keep doing that reasoning, what you're hired for in the first place. Now, the way I just presented it is ideal world, right? Ideal world is that we are as preventative and proactive as possible. The reality is we don't always exist in the ideal world. And so I want to be clear that this is also an appropriate approach to take when somebody is dysregulated, when somebody is completely, in that bottom part of the brain and really, really struggling. I had a student once, he was 17 years old. We'll call him Joey for the sake of today's conversation. Joey was in another teacher's class one day. He's a student that I had, but on this particular day, he was in another teacher's class. And I'm guessing he was having a rough day because the teacher had said to him, if you do one more thing, I'm going to send you out of the classroom to our counselor's office. And so a few minutes later, the student sitting next to Joey threw something in the room, and the teacher assumed it was Joey and sent him out. Joey went down to the counselor's office and he said, it wasn't me. It was this other kid. I shouldn't be here right now. I didn't do this thing. And after a few minutes of back and forth, Joey came to the conclusion, I don't know if it was reality or not, but he came to the conclusion that even though he did not do this thing, he was going to get blamed for it. And when that happened, Joey snapped. He started yelling and screaming and cursing up a storm. He started pulling things off the counselor's desk, pieces of paper, stapler, things like that, throwing it all around the room. There were these two large wooden cubbies attached to the wall. He slammed his hands down on them. They broke into pieces and fell to the floor. He is destroying this space. There's other furniture in the room that he's throwing around. I happened to have a free period while this was happening. Somebody came and got me. They said, Josh, you have a good relationship with Joey. Can you come talk to him? He's completely losing it. I was like, yeah, sure, no problem. And so I walk into the room where he is, and I just take one look at him, and I'm like, oh man, my relationship with him means nothing right now. I could just kind of walk in there and be like, hey, what's going on, bud? Throw my arm around him. But that next chair is just going to come my direction. What I think is important to understand real quick is that when a child is completely dysregulated like that, sometimes our go-to approach is to use our relationship. But I think it's really important that we remember that our relationship stops largely at that limbic spot. And so if they are beneath the limbic level of the brain, our relationship is enough to let us enter the space, but it is not enough to actually regulate them. There's something called relational regulation. That's where we can regulate somebody through a relationship, but that only works when they're in that limbic part of the brain. When they are lower than that, you cannot rely on your relationship with them alone to be able to regulate them. And so once again, that's what allowed me to walk into the room, but it's not going to be enough to calm him down. And so realizing that, I ran upstairs, I grabbed 2 large cups of water, and I came back down to the room where he was, and I reached my hand out and I said, you look thirsty, bud. You want some water? Thankfully, he reached his hand out, he took that water, and I stood next to him and I just said, take slow sips, take slow sips. Now, it might seem like I was just trying to hydrate him for his next round of furniture throwing, but the truth is, water is extremely regulating. When you drink water, it actually softens the bags of your lungs, which allows oxygen to more freely flow up to your brain. When you drink water, it's good for hydration, which is good for the functionality of your brain. But third, and perhaps most important, drinking water is kind of like a breathing exercise. I think a lot of us likely already know that breathing exercises are so important. And when you're low in your brain, focusing on breathing is something that can be absolutely helpful. But if I came in there and said, hey, I want you to breathe into a count of 4, hold it for a count of 4, breathe out, that's a great strategy that he's likely not going to buy into at that moment in time. But one of the best tools I've ever found is just handing a dysregulated child a bottle of water or a cup of water and just giving them the chance to drink it. They have to slow their breathing down to be able to drink that and not spill it all over themselves. So it is a breathing exercise in and of itself without saying those words out loud. Now, a lot of people ask me when I share this story, like, how did you know he wouldn't throw that water on you or that he would actually do that? And I want to be honest, I didn't know. Once again, me being relationally safe, I wasn't the person who sent him out in the first place. I hadn't engaged him with him in a negative way yet. So me being relationally safe allowed me to walk into the space and him not feel as offended by my presence there. But in addition to that, when you're low in your brain, you can pay attention to your basic life needs. And when you're dysregulated and having an externalizing response like that, you become dehydrated very, very quickly. Your mouth gets dry very quickly. You need some level of sustenance. And so, offering that water, not only was it kind of a little bit of a surprise, like I was expecting you to come in and yell at me, and instead you're offering me a cup of water right now. But in addition to that, it's something that his body knew that he needed. And so he took that water and started taking sips. Real quick, I have shared this story many times over the last 15 years. And I can't tell you how many people have come back and just said, like, that was one of their biggest takeaways is just that always having water on hand, handing that water out, and how, even if the next steps look a little bit different than what I'm about to share, but just giving them that water was such an amazing first step to beginning this regulate, relate, reason process. And so that sip of water and that focus on breath, that activates the brainstem, which is kind of step one to this whole regulation piece. And then once he was drinking that first cup of water, I walked around the room and I started picking up the small stuff, pens, pencils, stapler, pieces of paper, just some of those little things that he'd thrown around the room. And when I saw that he finished that second cup of water, I walked over to this large piece of wood from the wooden cubby that he was attached to the wall that he'd broken. And I just said, hey, bud, this is too heavy for me. Can you help me pick this up? And thankfully, he came over next to me, and together we picked that up and we leaned it against the wall. And then together we walked around the room and we picked up all the furniture that he'd kind of thrown around and put the room back together as best we could. What I want to be crystal clear about here is that no part of me said or implied to him, you made this mess, you better clean it up. That's cortical, and he's not ready for that yet. Will there be a time for consequences? Absolutely, there will be. But now is not the time to dish those consequences out. He's not ready for that yet. And so the reason that I started picking up the small stuff first was because I was showing him, like, one way or another, I'm cleaning up this room, right? So I was modeling to him that I was already going to clean up the room. And then word choice was so key after that. When I walked over to that large piece of wood, I didn't say clean this up or pick this up. I said, hey, can you help me with this? I was giving him a choice. When you're low in your brain, you seek out control. If you think about a lot of the dysregulated behaviors that some students exhibit that when you're interacting with them, one of the common threads that you'll often see is that they are seeking some type of control. There is safety in control. And so when you're low in your brain, you want as much control as you possibly can because that helps you to feel safe. You're going to elope the room and go where you want to go. You're going to say what you want. You're going to use the words that you want to use. You're going to dress the way that you want to. You are seeking control in those moments in time. And so when we know that a child is lower in their brain, the more choice we can give them, the more likely they are to be able to fall in line with some of the behaviors that we want them to do. So simply asking them, hey, can you take a walk with me? Or can you do this thing? Or giving them, do you want to do this or do you want to do that? It gives them control, which is going to make it much more likely that they're going to be able to begin to move up out of the situation that they're in. So thankfully, he made the choice to help me and pick that piece of furniture up and then pick the rest of that furniture up. The reason that I wanted him to do that is, once again, remembering what we talked about earlier, your midbrain is that physical part of your brain. And so this is the part of your brain that really loves anything that you can do with your muscles. And so utilizing your large muscles in a controlled way helps to regulate the midbrain, helps to calm down these lower parts of the brain. And so getting him to help with that was a great way to help to just further calm him down. By the time we had that room put back together as best we could, his big behaviors of concern had completely subsided. He was no longer yelling or cursing and screaming. He was no longer throwing things around the room. His breathing had slowed down. The eyes that were darting around the room when I first walked in could now actually focus on me again. And I knew that now he was regulated. Now his body looked very, very calm. Now, I want to be honest. The temptation here, the second they seem calm, is to jump right up to the cortex, is to jump right up to the reasoning piece. And what often happens when we do that is that we accidentally end up re-triggering that child and we get right back to where we started. And that's because we're not sequentially working up the brain. So what we need to do is we need to take this step-by-step approach, and we need to stop at the limbic system still. That's that relate part of the brain. I spent the next few minutes with Joey just talking to him, not talking about the events of the day, not talking about future consequences. All of that is cortical, but just talking back and forth to him. He and I did have a good relationship. He was in some of my classes. We had a respect for each other. I knew things he was interested in. So, I tried to get him to laugh a little bit, knowing things he thought was funny. Laughter is extremely regulating for you. But also just talking about dirt biking and football and just things that I knew that he had interest in. And my goal is, over those next few minutes, I wanted him to remember, like, this is Josh. Josh likes me. I like him. Josh respects me. I respect Josh. I wanted him to kind of feel that level of safety, that relational safety in that moment in time, that kind of, once again, checks that box for that part of the brain and say, like, I feel safe right now. I know that this person cares about me. And when that happens, then we can move up to the cortex. And in that circumstance, getting up to the cortex meant having a conversation about, hey, you need to go home. And by the way, you're probably not going to be at school tomorrow either. And there might be some other consequences for what's going on here. And he was able to hear that and not get re-triggered by it. That's cortical, the ability to take responsibility for your action. He felt that it was unfair that he got sent out of class for something someone else did. But at the same time, he understood that his behavior thereafter was not appropriate for school. And he was able to understand that. That's cortical. He was able to self-advocate, which is also cortical. He said, hey, can I wait in another room for my ride to come? Also, can you call my PO and tell them what happened today? I'm going to get upset if I have to repeat this story to them. And so he was able to kind of communicate through all of that. And what I think is so important about this process is that even though this wasn't the best day, even though there was some kind of work to be done after this day, obviously, is that he can reflect back on this day and know, even at my worst, these people aren't giving up on me. Even at my worst, these people care about me. And as much as I wouldn't wish a day like that on anyone, the opportunity to prove to the children that we work with that we're there for them, we support them, we care about them, is an amazing opportunity. And in these highly dysregulated moments, we have that chance to prove, hey, we're going to be patient, we're going to help, we're always going to be by your side, we're going to do whatever it takes to help you. And I think that that is so incredibly important. One piece that I like to add to this story that I think has a lot to do with why I'm here, but not as much to do specifically with regulate, relate, reason, is something that I learned about Joey several months after this event. And what I learned was that before Joey was born, Joey's mother had an affair with her husband's best friend, and Joey was the result of that affair. Upon finding out, Joey's father got understandably upset and they got separated, but they lived in such a low socioeconomic status that they had to stay living together and absolutely hating each other. Every single day of Joey's life, he was told that he was the reason for all of the anger and hatred in his home. Joey's biological father lived 2 blocks away. Joey's biological father made it crystal clear that he wanted nothing to do with Joey because Joey was a reminder of how he lost his best friend. Joey was blamed every single day of his life for something somebody else did. When I heard that story, I immediately thought back to the day that I just described to you a few moments ago, where he got sent out of class for something someone else did and was majorly triggered by that moment. And when I heard that, all of a sudden his behavior made so much more sense. All of a sudden, you could understand why he would have such a huge response to this really kind of fairly small thing that happened at school. And I share that for 2 reasons. For one, is that if we happen to know our students' stories, if we happen to know the stories of the children that we have the opportunity to interact with, chances are all of a sudden their dysregulated behavior, their bizarre behavior would make so much more sense. All of a sudden we would understand, oh, that's why you responded that way. Okay, now I understand why you're doing that. But the reality is, it's very rare that we hear the whole story. It's very rare that we get to hear absolutely everything that's gone on with them. And so when we think about supporting children, what we're really thinking about is giving every single child the benefit of the doubt that they want to do well. And if they are not doing well, something else is getting in the way. If they're not falling in line with our expectations, if they're regularly getting dysregulated, something else is getting there. They're not making that personal choice, but something else is going on. I cannot tell you how many times I've worked with adults who were supporting really challenging youth. And then when they finally found out about the life experiences of that youth, they were like, oh my goodness, if only I'd known that sooner, I would have treated them so much different. I would have done so much more. I would have X, Y, or Z. And I've seen that happen so many times that I'm like, we just need to operate under the assumption that every child has something going on. We don't need to assume that there's intentionality behind any of these challenging behaviors, but instead, we want to give every single child the benefit of the doubt. And in every single situation, we want to take this bottom up approach. We want to see, how can I give you the support that you need to be successful? So I wanted to obviously walk through that specific story with you there, but now we're going to take kind of a step-by-step approach with each of these, where I just want to share a handful of more tools and interventions that can be utilized to help with this kind of bottom-up approach and some kind of ideas along the way. So first and foremost, when we're thinking about that step one, that regulation piece, once again, some of these can be things that we do in the moment, and some of this can be things that we put in place preventatively for children that we know get dysregulated a lot, to help to actually avoid the dysregulating behavior, to proactively get in front of some of those behaviors so that we're not seeing that as much. Now, one of the key things to keep in mind is that when we're thinking about regulation, we're thinking about the brainstem and the midbrain, those bottom 2 parts of the brain. And so all of these things that we're going to share here, they can really work for both of those. So the number one thing that we're really trying to seek out is helping that child to become calm. So we're literally trying to help them to become physically calm in that moment in time. Some things to consider: physical comfort. So that could literally be, what type of seating do they have right there? Is it like a comfortable beanbag? Are they in a chair that's more comfortable? Like flexible seating is becoming more and more popular in a lot of environments. If you happen to work in children's homes, kind of having a spot that they feel comfortable in. So maybe moving out of the kitchen chair and into the living room or something like that, allowing them to get more physically comfortable. Rocking front to back is associated with calming the brain stem. So you might see that when a child gets upset, they might be in a chair rocking front to back. Some will literally, get down and kind of hug their knees and rock front to back. But that front to back motion is a way that actually regulates the brain stem. And so putting them in a chair that gives them the opportunity to do that. Similar with physical comfort can also be like wrapping the body up. Some kids, you'll see they put the hoods up, but they're getting in trouble a lot for that now. Wrapping themselves up in a blanket, giving themselves pressure around their body. Almost think of it as swaddling a newborn child. That physical comfort that they get from that helps to calm the body down. So thinking in your setting, and once again, I get that there's many different settings represented here, but in your setting, are there things that are socially appropriate that you can do to help to make that child physically feel more comfortable in that moment in time? Music is really good to help us to regulate. Music specifically that's at about 60 beats per minute. Your heart rate tries to match that of the music that you are listening to. So when you have music, even if it's just playing really quietly in the background at about 60 beats per minute, your heart rate will try to match that. And so whether you are likely to have an externalizing response or an internalizing response, it's going to help to kind of keep your heart rate way more regulated so that you're less likely to then have some of the bigger behavioral responses to different things that are going on. Sensory opportunities, once again, depending on your setting, this can actually open up to a lot of things, but the most common is just, physical sensory. What are the things that I like to touch? So fidgets have obviously gotten very, very popular. Specifically for the brain stem, it's more about texture. For the midbrain, it might be more about the actual movement of the fidget that they have. So just paying attention to each individual you work with and their unique preferences. I always say not all fidgets are created equally. So it's about figuring out what is the right tool for that individual that I'm trying to help, for that individual that I'm trying to support at that moment in time. So taking time to really figure out the best tool for them. Think of other senses as well. So things like smell. Are there ways that you are able to change the scent in your environment? There's a little bit of research that I've seen on specific smells, like something like lavender is more likely to have a calming response. Something like mint is more likely to have an energizing response. But at the end of the day, everybody is individual. I said that at a training the other day, and this person was like, "Oh, I hate lavender. That would never calm me down." I'm like, "Okay, like that's fine. We each have our own individual preferences as well." But there's just a little bit of research to back up some of that. But obviously, nothing is at 100%. Even taste, like getting a mint in your mouth or a certain gum or different things like that. So just thinking about all of the senses and just like, is there a texture? Is there some type of experience that we're able to offer that is calming? Sight as well, like especially, I mean, there's different things about colors and natural colors and things like that that's really helpful. Being able to see nature or the outdoors is amazing. But in addition, just like a messy space is actually really dysregulating for a lot of people, at least, not necessarily everybody. And so just being organized can actually help to create a lot more calm in the brain as well. Oral activation, one of the things that we'll see a lot when somebody is dysregulated or if they have some brainstem maldevelopment is that their mouth is moving constantly or they're constantly humming or talking or making noises. You just see a whole lot going on with that mouth. And so getting something in their mouth, whether it's gum, whether it's, even just like chewy foods, or we've used that chew jewelry you use for a teething infant and getting that for a child. So giving them opportunities for that. Controlled movement. Think about, moving that furniture with Joe, using the large muscles in a controlled way. So just creating opportunity to be able to move in a fairly controlled way. When it's brain stem, it's like very, very controlled. They think more like balance and stretching. When you get to the midbrain, think more like exercise and walking. I try to avoid the like crazy dance party or go do something hyper physical, just because that can actually have kind of an adverse effect on it. And then breath. I talked earlier about when somebody's low in their brain, they might not buy into all the different breathing exercises, but if you teach them ahead of time, sometimes they'll be willing to buy in. Or drinking water and understanding, the breath that can kind of just come along with that. Also having fun with it, once again, especially but not exclusively as a preventative tool. I do a breathing activity where I have my children like fold up a piece of paper into a paper football. That's that triangle. And then the classic kind of paper football game is that you have to flick that little triangle and get it just hanging off the side of a table or a desk. And that's how you get a touchdown. And so I'll tell a child, like, hey, I want you to get as many touchdowns as you can in the next 90 seconds, but the only thing you can use to move that football is your breath. And so they're taking controlled breath after controlled breath after controlled breath. And so they're having fun with it. So it creates a higher level of buy-in, but it really helps to calm them down. One hint here that I think is really important when we're thinking about regulating strategies is that fewer words are typically going to be better at this point. And I'll be honest, as you can probably tell by me jabbering onto you for the last 55 minutes, that's a struggle for me. And I think that's a struggle for a lot of us as we're supporting young people. We want to talk our way out of a lot of issues. We want to tell them what we're feeling, what they're feeling, and we want to rationalize with them. And now is not the time for that. That can come in the future, but now is not the time for words. Now is as few words as possible, keeping my mouth shut as much as I possibly can. And this is more about what are the opportunities that I can provide for you to move, to calm down, to get that level of comfort. So it's more about what opportunities do you have and trying to use as few words as possible. Once they are calmed down, once their body is calm, remember, we don't want to skip this next step, and that is strategies to help them to relate. And so the relate piece, I think some of this is probably a bit more self-explanatory, and are things that a lot of you are very naturally good at. But I think it's just that reminder to not skip over the steps. So once they are calm, they need to feel, and I apologize, I wrote rational safety. I meant to write relational safety. Missed out on a couple letters there. But we're trying to think, how do we create relational safety in this situation right now? And so for one, now is the time to check in, apologize. I am a big believer in apologizing to children. Sometimes there's things that I've done and I need to be like, hey, I'm so sorry. You didn't deserve for me to talk to you that way, or I made an assumption and I was wrong. Also, we can apologize for how they perceived it. Hey, I'm so sorry that you thought that I disrespected you, or that you felt that I was trying to be rude, or anything like that. But letting them know, like, you're sorry for the experience that they had from you. So I'm a big believer in that. I can't tell you how many times I've apologized to students of mine when I was in the classroom, and they would come back and tell me, you know what? You're the first adult to ever apologize to me. And it's so important that they hear that they are worthy of that. That not the rest of the world's not perfect and they're just the scripts. Everybody messes up. It's important that they hear that and understand that for their own level of just, self value, if you will. In addition to that, trying to give them one-on-one attention. Obviously, depending on the situation, that can look different. Sometimes that's literally pulling them out. Sometimes you're already working one-on-one and you can connect with them. Sometimes that might be dropping like a little note or little, kind of just one-on-one moment with them, just to help them to know like that they're seen and that they're heard. Little things with that one-on-one attention, like letting them hear their name when you're talking to them in a positive way. So like just hearing their name helps them to feel further connected. If you're working with a child that you are able to have any physical contact with, I get that that's a sketchy spot. So, like, know your children and know if that's not right. But if you are able to, a firm pat to the center of the back, that's going to have a greater impact than like a high five, like touching an extremity. And so walking over them being like, hey, great job, or hey, I'm here for you, or, hey, anything you need, let me know. But giving a firm pat to the center of the back helps them to feel more connected with you. And that's going to have a longer lasting, calming relational impact for them. Any type of positive connection, lifting them up, saying something positive, that helps them to feel seen, that helps them to feel connected. Parallel interaction, that's going to be being shoulder to shoulder with them rather than face to face. So as you're reconnecting with them, being next to them, especially like if you're able to take a walk, that's great, or sitting next to them on the ground or on a couch or at a table, that's going to be better than being across from them. When you're across from them, face to face with them, that's just much more challenging. That's going to be much more stressful for them. And so trying to be situated in a way that helps them to feel far safer is something that's going to be really helpful. Creating space for us to listen, and once again, so like giving them voice, allowing them the ability to speak is super helpful and express their feelings without us arguing with what their experience was. And just avoid the higher level of thinking. Like, so once again, we're not jumping to that experience yet unless they lead the way there. This is about reconnecting with them. I think one more kind of piece of this is really asking ourselves, who are these children's people? Like, who are the people that this child feels the safest with, and do we have access to that person? Because if I'm the person who maybe played an active role in helping them to be dysregulated, it's not impossible for me to help to calm them down, but it's going to be better if somebody who they feel more automatically relationally safe with is able to be there in the process with them. So just asking, is somebody else available, or am I the best person to do this process with them right now? And then lastly is the reasoning. And what I think is important to understand is that once somebody's in a cortex, it doesn't mean that they are like all of a sudden just perfect and everybody who's in their cortex behaves perfectly all the time. But it's more just about that they're now able to, think before they act, and put that kind of space between these feelings and their responses. So they're ready again for manageable stress. And so they're ready for you to jump back into whatever that task at hand was, whether that's academics, whether that's planning for the future, whether that's signing a behavioral plan, whatever the case might be, they're ready to dive back into that. And we want to just make sure that we're not re-triggering, that we're not re-traumatizing them at this point in time. So once again, keeping that stress manageable, being mindful about how we are embracing that conversation. And this is also the part where we can plan for the future with them. Once again, giving them voice is so incredibly important at this part of the process. So, what could we do differently next time? What are regulating tools that we could put in place? What are things that maybe brought us to this point that we could try to avoid in the future? And now is the time. If there are consequences, if there are natural outcomes that came from whatever, now they're ready to hear those things and we can discuss them and talk about them. But we don't want to do that too early in the process. My big hint for this is really to be a detective of the children that you work with. Try to figure out what might have caused this. What might be some of those triggers? What might be some of the tools that, if they utilized, would have avoided some of these behaviors of concern. And so trying to be a detective, figure some of those things out. And then when they're in this part of the brain, now that they're up in their cortex, they're ready to do that reasoning. Now's the time to really talk through a lot of that and try to support them with that. One other kind of piece here is that it's really important to realize that a dysregulated adult is going to really struggle to support a dysregulated child. And so when we're thinking about going through this process with them, we really need to ask ourselves, am I actually in a spot right now where I'm able to help to support this child? Am I regulated enough to take care of them? The big reason for this is that we have these things in our brain called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons fire when you see something occurring in the same way they would fire if they were doing that, if you were doing that thing yourself. And so to put this most simply in this situation here, if you have a dysregulated child and you are a calm adult, that child can look at you and they have neurons in their brain that are decoding the fact that you are calm, and they will have neurons begin to fire off as though they themselves are calm. And so literally your calmness is able to be contagious to them. You're able to be a barometer to your students' level of calm to help them to be in the best spot that they can possibly be in. But conversely, if you're dysregulated, they're going to see you and they're going to have neurons firing and say, oh, shoot, this person's dysregulated as well, which tells them maybe I'm not safe right now. And if we're the barometer for calm, we're also the barometer for chaos. And so it's telling their brains, you know what, I might not be in a good spot right now. Maybe things aren't as safe as I want them to be right now. And so it is a whole other session to dig into this. So I just think it's worth mentioning, but we're not going to get into all the details of it right now. But your self-care, taking care of yourself and being regulated yourself will have a direct impact on your students or your children's level of regulation. It will help them to become regulated as well. And so taking care of yourself is not selfish, it is selfless, and it helps to put the children that you have the opportunity to work with in a much more likely spot to be able to maintain their level of regulation. The last thing that I want to quickly touch on here before we move into the Q&A part of this session is realizing that what all of this really leads to is really long-lasting brain change. Sometimes when I give a presentation like this, I'll get feedback that's like, that's all great, but what happens when the child goes into the quote unquote real world? What happens when they don't have all these levels of support? And for one, I argue a little bit with that sentiment because I think that the quote unquote real world keeps changing and is much more adaptable for the needs of people that might need a little bit more help to self-regulate in challenging situations. But beyond that, the goal behind all of this is that it actually helps to begin to positively change the brain. In the same way that a newborn child who has consistent caregiving pretty quickly learns that every time they're hungry, the world is not about to end, but that they are able to calm down and get to a better spot. The more that we offer regulating opportunities to children throughout the course of the day, the more that we teach them tools that help them to become regulated, the less time that they spend dysregulated because we're creating an environment that's supportive of them, the more that their brain actually becomes used to being regulated, the more that their brain actually begins to kind of rewire to be much more regulated the majority of the time. So when we talk about self-regulation, we're literally talking about brain change. And we're talking about making really long lasting brain change for our children. And so, my big kind of question and challenge for you all as you walk away from today's setting is to really be thinking about how are you going to help to change a child's brain? How can you take some of these ideas around self regulation, some of these ideas around those 3 R's, and implement them into your role? And realizing that this is not just about making your life easier for the moment, but as we instill these things again and again and again, it actually creates positive brain change for every child. And when we're doing that, we all become agents of change for the children that we have the opportunity to help and the opportunity to support. As we kind of shift over into the Q&A side, just a couple of real quick things. For one, please, please, please feel free to reach out to me if there's any questions that for any reason you do not feel comfortable asking in front of the large group. I have a website, email address there, our social media. We try to put helpful hints and information out there through Facebook and Instagram. We also have a LinkedIn page if you prefer that. So please feel free to follow us on that for information or to just stay in contact with us. If you're all interested in how InMind could support any of the agencies that you might be with or the organizations that you're with, or if you work with schools, please feel free to let us know. And we'd love to explore what that might look like to come in and provide some level of support. And then lastly, this is for you, but also any of the families that you might work with. We have an online family membership where we do trainings like this and many, many more. So if you would like to have more information like what we talked about here today, or you think that some of the families you work with would benefit from training like this, feel free to pass on the QR code in the middle. We'll send you there. And then the membership code is PA Cares. That'll get you 50% off. So it goes from $100 for a year to $50. So if you would find that helpful, please feel free to take advantage of that. But from there, I can open it up and for the first time, try to look at the chat during this presentation.
Thank you so much, Josh. It was a wonderful presentation. Did get a lot of comments in the chat. So I think it was worthwhile.
Awesome. Thank you for all the kind comments. I really appreciate that.
We did have a question. We have about 6 of them so far.
Oh, perfect.
David wanted to, well, he made a statement and then asked a question. Said an entirely new kind of parenting education that reaches everyone, everywhere, could be an extraordinarily powerful kind of primary prevention. A kind of parenting education that reaches grandparents, raising grandchildren, mature parents, young parents, soon to be parents, teens, and school age children. A kind of parenting education that would not have an end date and would become a permanent fixture of our culture. Is this something public health authorities should be developing?
I mean, I think the short answer is what you presented there with that statement, I think is such a dream, and I'd be fine with anybody doing it, right? Like whoever can get the word out there. One of the things that I mean, the picture that was painted there is even bigger and more beautiful than this. But I always think about how, like, before having a child, how every adult has to watch like that one, like the shaken baby thing and things like that. Like just understanding like the very basics of how to not harm your newborn child. And I always dream of like, hey, what would it look like for us to be able to do this? Some version of this for every newborn parent, right? So that they are basically just getting some basic idea of what their role is from the developmental side there. So, yeah, I think that public health is probably a realistic place for it. Just so you know, the reason I do, not exclusively, but I do so much work with schools and through school districts because that they cast just a wide web in many communities for kids passing through them from Head Start all the way up through them turning into adults. And so I like that, but I love what you're presenting more because it's capturing children in the first few years of life that school districts aren't able to capture them.
Sure. Karen wanted to know, as the brain ages, is the cortex less accessible, thus impacting a senior's ability to respond to their environment?
Oh, that's interesting. Like you're talking like since you're saying seniors, you're talking as we get much, much, much older, I'm assuming. Um, so I'll be honest. First off, I know a lot more about the developing brain than the undeveloping brain on the back end. I don't necessarily think that it is actually, I could be wrong. I don't actually think that it's about being less accessible. I do think that there is degradation that occurs, some level of degradation that occurs over time. In fact, when brain plasticity was first discussed, 20, 30 years ago, a lot of it was so much more about understanding that our brains change negatively throughout life, not positively. And so I actually believe that what happens as we get older is it's not so much about access so much as or at least not bottom up access, but it's more that some of those higher cortical parts of the brain go through a little bit more of a use it, don't use it, you lose it type of thing. So that's why information begins to get lost. So we have less reliance. That's why there's so much out there right now about like as you age, using your brain a lot more, doing puzzles, doing crosswords, doing things like that really challenge your brain and use your whole brain because your neurons do operate off of a use it or lose it mentality. And so if you're not challenging your brain enough as you get older, your brain does a lot of pruning and it basically says we don't need that anymore, and so it cuts it off. So that would be my best guess, but I want to be once again transparent and say that's probably not my number one area of expertise.
Thank you for your answer. Um, an anonymous attendee wanted to know, they were saying that they don't understand if information always travels upwards, how come stress travels downwards?
Oh, that's a
Is
great. Oh, sorry.
no, isn't stress still information? That's what they were trying to say.
So that is a really, really, really good point. So here's kind of the. I mean, for one, let me just say that that's like the um, like when we take any model of the brain or any model of understanding, no model is 100% perfect all the time, right? So that's the first and foremost thing. Like as we look at this, we do want to understand that like this is a heuristic that has some flaws to it. With that said, what's happening is as we experience some type of stress, yes, our cortex at some point needed to at least kind of perceive what on earth is going on right now, and then it says, oh, I'm not the primary area that's going to be able to impact this. And so it largely begins to shut down. And I try to use like slight disclaimers in there where I say largely. It does not mean that our cortex is 100% offline, but it's probably 90% offline. Like it's that we're largely not operating out of it anymore, and that really the control goes into these lower parts of our brain. And so this is the part of the brain that we're actually relying on for a lot of our responses in that moment in time. So you're right that like we would need to get to the top of our brain for that to begin to shut down, but then our responses to the stressful situation are largely coming out of those lower parts of the brain.
Hate that. Shelby had a couple of questions. Wanted to know, how do you get buy-in from schools that are stuck in behaviorism and punitive discipline? And also wanted to know, do you do training in youth intervention centers or residential treatment centers?
I'll answer the second half first and then the first half second. So the second half, I haven't yet, but I'd love to. So certainly, if you felt like it's something that would make sense, I'd be more than happy to jump in and support however I could. Um, in terms of the buy-in, what I have consistently found again and again and again is that leading in with this brain-based approach really helps to kind of soften the blow for a lot of people, if you will, as we begin to think about taking a different approach to being able to support young people. So when I have the opportunity to work with districts or have a conversation with districts, what I'm really focusing on is let's understand what's actually at the root of a lot of these behaviors and understand how the brain works, such as what we discussed here today. And instead of attacking their like consequence-based approach, they begin to kind of become a little bit more softened to, oh, not all of these behaviors have this high level of intentionality to it. Instead, something else might be going on that can lead to some of these behaviors of concern. On top of that, what I would just kind of also add to as well is that when we understand the brain, so, and I do this when I'm working with schools, when I'm working with families, is that once again, when we focus in on that brain, it takes the personal side out of it. Because what often happens is if I have even my own children at home, if they say something to me or they're treating me in a certain type of way, it becomes really, really personal. And if I can't change their behavior, or once again, like as a teacher, again, like if my responses in the classroom are not changing the behavior, it's hard for me to not think that that reflects poorly on myself. And so all of a sudden, I'm taking that behavior really personal. I'm worried, like, does this mean I'm a bad teacher, that I'm bad at my job? And so when we push all that to the side and we say, you know what, step one, we're not talking about your school rules, rewards, consequences. Instead, what we're talking about is what's happening with this child. All of a sudden, it depersonalizes all of those behaviors and it helps to give us a different light. And so, I mean, even when I work with schools, usually I try to work with them for multiple years and I don't touch their their like school rules and policy on year one unless they're asking to, because I kind of want them to more organically realize like, oh shoot, this doesn't make sense with what we now understand. So that's kind of the path that I take to buy in with anybody really, but especially with schools.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because we as people, I think, automatically take certain behaviors as disrespect,
Yep.
and disrespect isn't to be tolerated. Like,
Yep.
it is, and so you react as you're being disrespected instead of thinking, well, what's happening with this other person? Why are they engaging me in this way? So you make a very, very good point there. Uh, Now, Marie asked, a lot of these things can be generational. Do you teach professionals how to work with parents as well? When children are navigating the real world, parental support is important.
Yeah, yeah. So absolutely. My goal is to get this information out to anybody in a multitude of different ways, right? So sometimes that's to the teacher to, hey, here's how you can work with your child, with the students in your classroom. Sometimes that's directly with a parent, but also sometimes that's with another third party who might say, okay, how do I train or teach this adult what's going on in this situation? So absolutely, it kind of flows in many different directions. Because my goal, what I care about, is I want every single child to exist in environments that are neurodevelopmentally supportive to them. And I realize that it makes a lot more sense for me to work with, once again, the adults in the lives of those children. And that could be the ones that are doing direct care, which is where I'm mostly focused, or in an example like that, somebody who might then have more of an impact with their parents to share information, give ideas and strategies so that as many people as possible, once again, can exist in an environment like that. So yeah, absolutely. I agree with sharing that information and with whomever to kind of pass it along, if you will.
Thank you. This participant asks a question and gives a bit of an example. They want to know what to do when a teacher's style is dysregulating the student. In the case they are thinking of, the student is great all day, but is completely dysregulated in English class. It isn't a strong subject for the student, so he is naturally already feeling stress. The style of the teacher is making it worse, and he is now getting in trouble in the class, and our participant doesn't know how to help. The teacher sees the kid as disrespectful and disruptive, and not dysregulated.
Yeah. That's a tough one. I mean, not to, like I love it. I think that the biggest challenge is always going to be how willing, open, flexible, whatever you want to call it, is that teacher to hearing some level of feedback and the ability to change or willingness to change. So obviously, it depends a bit on that individual and a bit on the school or the setup like that. The more specific one is capable of being for why that teacher style is dysregulating, I think that that's kind of step one. So for instance, I was in a classroom once, and it was in it was in Philadelphia, and a lot there was this one teacher in particular who his style was he was loud. Like he was a yeller, not angry, but just a yeller. And I had to kind of help him to understand, like, hey man, like when you raise your voice, even if you're not yelling at kids, it's triggering for a lot of people. It's dysregulating for a lot to hear an elevated voice. And so their brains are saying, oh my goodness, there might be chaos right now. And so it dysregulates a lot of those children. And it took a long time. I won't go into the whole classic story, but a long time to kind of get him to accept that and change his behavior. But once he finally did, it really impacted those kids. But when we can be really specific and say, hey, it's because of the way you talk, it's because of your, fill in the blank. If there's something that's very, very specific like that, that's going to make it a lot easier to then have a conversation with that teacher. And especially if there's an ounce of background. It's like because of, and not that I don't want to ever disclose like a child's like personal trauma history or anything like that, but if we're able to connect the dots a little bit of just like, hey, because of some of our life experiences, when you talk that way or say that way or get into my personal space or whatever that dysregulating behavior might be, that is really causing that, that's what we can begin to kind of think about and dive into a little bit. But and that's one that I will just say, like, I'd be really happy to dig more into the specifics of that if you'd rather reach out to me separately, because I think that there's just going to be a lot of nuance depending on the specific thing that child finds to be dysregulating and whatnot.
Thank you. Another participant says they have two children with RAD, which I believe is reactive attachment disorder.
Yep.
They are both adopted. When trying to give them a break after regulation and then coming back to the issue, we experience re-escalation and dysregulation. What is the best ways to approach this so that we can effectively have a resolution? The mindset of the children are once they are over the issue, it is done and over. Why bring it back up?
Yeah. So I think that there's a couple things that we've done to kind of approach things with that, especially when, I mean, you're talking about something as complex as RAD. Obviously, that's going to be impacting, that's a very limbic level thing, right? So your social emotional capacity, and it goes deeper than that. And once again, I'll always admit when there's something I'm not an expert at, and that's, that specific diagnosis. I wouldn't say that in any way, shape, or form I'm a complete expert at it. What I would say is that if I'm hearing this right, the issue is you're going to have circumstances that are challenging. You're going to be able to move past them, but then the ability to reflect back on those circumstances is, that child's like, why are we talking about this right now? It's done and over. When I've had situations like that before, I think that, and once again, like knowing the RAD diagnosis, knowing that there's probably some things going on a social emotional level, that like the idea of revisiting that, it brings something up that is beyond their capacity to handle, right? So the personalization of that situation becomes really, really challenging for them to discuss. Like, I did this thing, I hurt you, or I said that, or whatever. And so what I often recommend is trying to basically do like look at situations that mirror that situation that you went through. So for instance, if it was, and I'm just throwing something random out there, but the child like saying something rude to the parent and how they should have handled that better, instead of once they calm down, sitting them down and being like, hey, when you talk to me that way, it really hurt me, and here's how I'd rather handle it. Instead of doing that, which is very personal, talk about a parallel situation, like, hey, I have this friend and this is what happened, or hey, look at this book, or look at this, and so we're talking about the same situation. Somebody got upset, somebody said something rude, that how could they have handled it differently, but you're taking the personalization away from it, and so you're learning it almost more as just a life lesson rather than this like personal experience that they went through. So once again, that would be my kind of initial thought for one approach that could be taken to do that. So you're once again, you're addressing the issue at hand without adding the personalization to it that seems to be what they're likely getting hung up on.
And our last question, does dysregulation look like ADHD at times? How do you decipher? Some people want to medicate it for hyperactivity. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So let me first off say part of the reason I started this presentation looking at neurodevelopment is that understanding that helps us to understand like dysregulation that comes very often when somebody has brainstem and even midbrain maldevelopment. That is oftentimes misdiagnosed as ADHD, or when somebody is highly stressed and they move down lower, like that can look very much like ADHD. Other diagnoses as well, but ADHD is a very, very popular one. And so to answer the question, yes, dysregulation and ADHD can look very, very similar. I think one of the key areas of difference would be the consistency of it. So if somebody's dysregulated sporadically, that's probably going to be more situational, meaning like, yeah, some days they get dysregulated 2 or 3 times and exhibit these big behaviors of concern, but then maybe tomorrow they have a great day, or maybe they even have a great week, and then all of a sudden there's another, like, then they have a bad week. When it's sporadic like that, then it's typically going to be something situational, something in their environment. Like, could be that something's happening at home, could be just the stress of whatever they're doing in life is catching up with them. When it is every single day, it's predictable. Some days might be worse than others, but still, every single day there's going to be an issue. Then it's either going to be developmental or ADHD. And then from there, I mean, to decipher between the two of those, really, for one, you could look at if you happen to know their trauma history, you could make some bigger predictions. The second piece of it that I often talk about, by the time I'm usually observing a child or working with the folks that are working with a child, that child usually already has the diagnosis and is medicated for it. And if the medication is working and it's a positive thing, it's like, yeah, that very well may have been ADHD. When it's a situation where they keep having to up the meds again, again, and again, and it doesn't seem to have any lasting impact, that's where I begin to question maybe ADHD wasn't the right diagnosis, and that might actually be more of a developmental issue that's going on.
Got one last question that's in here. Do you find that you need to teach some of these students to understand what they are noticing and feeling in their own bodies to understand signs of dysregulation?
Yeah. So I'm a big believer in, kind of step one is working with the adults and then really encouraging the adults to work with the children and explain all of that. I find giving them language is so incredibly powerful. When I was first learning this information, I had just like a cool, like artistic picture of the brain in my classroom. And as I was learning stuff, I was like, oh guys, like this is where we want to be up here. And sometimes I think we're down here. And I actually, began to get to a point where I would have students come into my classroom and they'd be like, oh, I feel like I'm down here right now. And then when I became a parent, I was obviously talking to my kids about all this as well. And I would have times where like even my like 5-year-old would be like, I think I'm in my brainstem right now, daddy. Like they begin to learn that language. One kind of side note, and I'll try not to spend too much time on this, but it's certainly something that I'd be happy to talk about further at some point. But one of the things I found is that a lot of kids, when they get dysregulated, the adults in their lives try to get them to label the emotions that they're feeling. And some kids can do that, but some kids really struggle with that. And a lot of the kids that I've had the opportunity to work with would really struggle with some of that. And so trying to get them to say, I feel anxious or stressed or angry, like that was almost more dysregulating for them because they couldn't label these specific emotions. And so one of the things that I started to work on with them is as we talked about kind of the biology of the brain, we understand that when somebody gets more and more dysregulated, their pulse actually changes. For the externalizing response, your pulse is going to get higher and higher and higher, literally sending more blood to your extremities. And for the internalizing response, your pulse is actually going to get lower and lower, pulling blood away from your extremities. And so teaching someone A, just to feel those physical changes, or B, to take their pulse, that actually helps to give them this kind of understanding like, oh, I'm getting less regulated right now. I'm like moving away from my baseline right now. And so I'm not in as good of a spot. And then it gives them something incredibly tangible to work on, which is just that number. So if you teach them, like, hey, on a good day, I'm at a 75, and right now I'm at 105, I don't need to worry about, am I anxious or am I angry? I just need to know what are the tools that get my pulse from 105 to 75? Is that breathing? Is that drinking water? Is that going for a walk? And so trying to start with something super tangible like a number and their pulse is an amazing place to start. And that's something that I found a lot of kids can learn. And then from there, they can begin to connect some of the dots a bit more with a supportive adult to help them to understand what some of those specific emotions might be and what some of those regulating tools might be that help them in those situations.
Thank you so much, Josh.
No,
For
absolutely. Thank you.
a wonderful presentation. And thank you for your very thoughtful answers to all of the questions that came in. I want to thank everybody who participated and attended today's presentation. Our next presentation will be on April 23rd. It is called Strengthening Empathy Through Motivational Interviewing. And we hope to see you then. Until then, everyone take care.
Thanks so much, everybody.